There's no greater fear than losing someone you die for, and no greater fury than discovering they were taken from you by lies. In the cold fjords of ancient Norway, Yrsa was a healer who saved lives with her gentle hands and strong heart. But when she healed the wrong child, the village accused her of dark magic. Their punishment was cruel beyond measure. They buried her alive beneath the sacred tree. For 3 days, she lay trapped in the earth, waiting for death. The village thought their justice was complete. They didn't know that Einar, the legendary warrior they believed had drowned, was clawing his way home through storms and enemies. When he found what they had done to the woman he loved, his rage shook the ground itself. With bare hands, he tore through the burial mound like a man possessed. His roar echoed across the fjord. "She's mine." But can even the strongest love bring someone back from the edge of death? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping gods, and in the village of Ravenshollow, Ursa moved through it like a whisper of hope. Her cottage sat at the edge of the settlement, close enough to answer urgent calls in the night, far enough to work her healing craft without constant scrutiny. The small wooden structure, weathered grey by countless storms, held treasures that would have seemed magical to those who didn't understand the patient art of healing. Inside, bundles of dried herbs hung from every rafter, meadowsweet for pain, willow bark for fever, and dozens of others whose secrets had been passed down through generations of wise women. But Yrsa's most precious tools were the smooth river stones that lined her workbench, each one carved with ancient runes that seemed to pulse with their own quiet light. Her grandmother had taught her that these healing stones held the memory of the old ways, when the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was thin as morning frost. "The stones choose their healer," her grandmother had whispered on her deathbed, pressing the worn leather pouch into Yrsa's young hands. "They've been waiting for you since before you were born." That had been 15 years ago, and in that time, Yrsa had built a reputation that stretched beyond Ravenshollow to the neighboring settlements. She was the woman who could ease a difficult birth when the midwife had given up hope. She was the one who could draw poison from infected wounds that had turned green with rot. Children with burning fevers cooled under her touch, and old men with rattling chests found their breath again after drinking her carefully brewed teas. The villagers whispered about her gifts, as people always do when faced with something they cannot fully understand. Some called it blessed skill, others wondered if there was something darker at work, but none could argue with her results, and so they brought their sick and dying to her door, grateful for her help, even as they crossed themselves and muttered protective prayers. Ravenshollow itself was a settlement caught between two worlds. The old ways still held sway in many hearts. The sacred tree at the village centre bore offerings of bread and ale from those who remembered when the gods walked among men. But Christian influences had been growing stronger each year, brought by traders and missionaries who spoke of a single God and the damnation that awaited those who clung to heathen practices. The yarl, Magnus Ironhand, walked a careful line between these competing faiths. His great hall bore both Thor's hammer and the Christian cross, and his decisions were guided as much by political necessity as personal belief. Magnus was a practical man who had seen too many villages torn apart by religious conflict. He preferred peace to purity, prosperity to theological debates. But even his diplomatic nature had limits, and the pressure from his Christian advisors grew stronger with each passing season. It was into this delicate balance that Einar Thrice-Blooded had arrived 3 summers ago, like a storm wind that changes everything it touches. He came with a reputation that preceded him, a warrior whose deeds were sung in halls from Iceland to the Saxon shores. They called him Thrice-Blooded because he had survived 3 battles that should have killed him, each time returning more legendary than before. But the man who knocked on Yrsa's door that first evening, seeking treatment for a sword cut that had festered during his journey, was not the fearsome berserker of tavern songs. He was gentle with her healing tools, careful not to disturb her carefully organized workspace. He listened when she explained which herbs would speed his recovery, asking thoughtful questions that showed he understood the wisdom behind her methods. "You heal with knowledge, not just hope," he had said, watching her grind willow bark with practiced motions. "My grandmother was like you. She said the best healers understand that body and spirit are not separate things." That simple observation had been the beginning of everything. In the weeks that followed, as his wound healed under her care, they had talked about the old wisdom that was slowly being forgotten. Einar had traveled widely and seen how different peoples approached the mysteries of life and death. He respected the power of the ancient ways while understanding that the world was changing, that survival often required adaptation. Their love had grown slowly, carefully, like a plant taking root in rocky soil. Both understood that their union would face opposition. She was a healer whose work some viewed with suspicion. He was a warrior whose loyalty belonged to no single lord. But love, true love, has its own logic that pays little attention to social convention. They had met in secret, sharing stolen hours beside the sacred tree when the village slept. They had planned a future together, imagining a life where his strength and her wisdom could serve their people without fear or judgment. Einar spoke of settling down, of using his warrior skills to protect rather than conquer. Yrsa dreamed of teaching her healing arts to others, of bridging the growing divide between old wisdom and new faith. But the world has its own plans, often crueler than human dreams. When word came of raids along the coast, Einar had been duty-bound to join the expedition. As one of the most skilled warriors in the region, his absence would have been seen as cowardice, a stain on his honor that would have followed him forever. Their last night together had been spent beneath the stars, making promises they both hoped they could keep. Einar had given her a small carved bird, a raven with wings spread in flight. "This is my oath to you," he had said, placing it in her hands. "No matter how far I sail, no matter what storms I face, I will always find my way back to you." She had given him one of her healing stones in return, a smooth piece of river granite, carved with the rune for protection. "Keep this close to your heart," she had whispered. "When the battle fury takes you, remember that someone waits for your safe return." The ships had sailed with the dawn tide, and for months Yrsa had continued her work, healing the sick and easing the dying while watching the horizon for familiar sails. Messages had come sporadically. The expedition was successful. They had driven off the raiders and were pursuing them into distant waters. Then silence had fallen like a shroud, broken only by rumors and conflicting reports. Some said the ships had been lost in a great storm. Others claimed they had sailed too far into unknown waters and been trapped by ice. A few spoke of a final battle against overwhelming odds, where brave men had chosen death before dishonor. As weeks turned to months with no word, the village had begun to accept what seemed inevitable. Einar, thrice-blooded, had finally met his match. For Yrsa, grief became another patient condition to treat. She continued her work because people depended on her, but those closest to her could see how the light had dimmed in her eyes. She spoke less, smiled rarely, and threw herself into her healing with an intensity that worried her friends. Only when working with her stones, feeling the ancient power flow through her hands into her patients, did she find any peace from the ache in her heart. The village elders watched her during this time, noting how her skills seemed to grow stronger, even as her spirit appeared to weaken. Where once she had been merely gifted, now her successes bordered on miraculous. Broken bones healed in days instead of weeks. Fevers that should have been fatal broke within hours of her treatment. Even her garden flourished beyond reason, producing healing herbs in quantities that defied the harsh northern climate. It was Astrid Night Whisper who first gave voice to the growing unease. Once the village's primary healer, she had been slowly eclipsed by Ursa's superior skills and had never quite forgiven the younger woman for her success. Astrid had embraced the Christian faith with the fervor of a convert, seeing in it both spiritual salvation and political advantage. She began to speak carefully, subtly, about the unusual nature of Yrsa's recent achievements. Grief affects people differently, she would say to anyone who would listen. Some grow stronger in their sorrow, but what kind of strength requires such a price? Have you noticed how the very air seems different around her cottage? How her garden grows when others fail? The seeds of suspicion, once planted, began to take root in fertile ground. The villagers had always been somewhat uneasy about Yrsa's gifts, and her recent enhancement of those abilities made them more nervous than grateful. In their minds, there was a line between blessed healing and something darker, and they were no longer certain which side of that line Yrsa occupied. The sacred tree at the village center had been ancient when the first Norse settlers arrived. Its massive trunk scarred by lightning and time, but still vibrantly alive. Local tradition held that it was a bridge between the world of men and the realm of the gods, a place where prayers were heard and justice was dispensed. For generations, it had been the site of important ceremonies. Births were blessed beneath. Its branches, marriages were sealed with oaths, sworn before its roots, and the guilty were judged under its watchful presence. It was beneath this tree that the village's fate would be decided, though none yet realized how completely their world was about to change. The old ways and the new faith would clash like sword against shield, and in the end, love would prove stronger than law, wisdom more powerful than fear, and the bonds between souls more enduring than the bonds of earth that hold the living and the dead apart. But first would come the test that would transform everything. A moment when healing would be mistaken for harm, when salvation would be seen as sorcery, and when the very gifts that had made Yrsa beloved would mark her for destruction. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the ancient powers that slept beneath Raven's Hollow were beginning to stir, sensing that the time of reckoning was at hand. The fever came in the night like a thief, stealing through the yarl's grate, Holland settling upon his youngest child with merciless intent. Little Bjorn, barely 6 winters old, and the light of his father's heart, had gone to sleep healthy and woke burning with a heat that seemed to come from the very core of his being. His skin was pale as fresh snow, his breathing shallow and rapid, and when he tried to speak, only whispers emerged from his cracked lips. Magnus Ironhand had faced charging berserkers without flinching, but the sight of his son's fevered stillness brought him to his knees beside the small bed. The hall's physician, a learned man who had studied in distant monasteries, tried bleeding and cold compresses, prayers and herbal draughts, but nothing touched the fire that consumed the boy from within. By the second day, Bjorn had stopped responding to his name. His eyes, when they opened at all, seemed to look through his parents rather than at them. The women of the hall whispered among themselves. They had seen such fevers before, and they rarely ended well. Children simply burned away like candles in a strong wind, leaving nothing behind but grief and bitter memories. It was the Jarl's wife Ingrid who finally spoke the words her husband could not bear to voice. "Send for Yrsa," she said, her hand never leaving their son's burning forehead. "If anyone can save him, it is she." Magnus had hesitated, knowing that calling for the healer would be seen as a sign of desperation by some, weakness by others. But watching his child slip further away with each labored breath, political concern seemed as insubstantial as morning mist. He sent his fastest rider to fetch Yrsa, with instructions to spare no effort in bringing her quickly. When Yrsa arrived at the great hall, she carried with her the leather pouch containing her healing stones and a small satchel of carefully selected herbs. One look at the dying child told her that this was no ordinary fever. Something deeper was at work, something that touched the spirit as much as the body. She knelt beside the bed and placed her hand gently on Bjorn's forehead, feeling the unnatural heat that radiated from his small frame. "How long has he been like this?" she asked quietly, already reaching for her stones. 3 days, Ingrid whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He won't eat, barely drinks, and we cannot wake him properly. Please, if there is anything you can do—" Yrsa nodded, her face serene despite the gravity of the situation. She had seen this before, though rarely in one so young. It was a fever of the spirit as much as the body, the kind that came when the soul began to drift away from its earthly home. Traditional remedies would not be enough. This would require the deepest wisdom her grandmother had taught her, the kind that drew upon powers older than Christianity or the Norse gods. She arranged her healing stones in a careful pattern around the child's bed, each one positioned according to knowledge passed down through countless generations of wise women. The stones seemed to pulse with their own inner light as she worked, their carved runes glowing faintly in the dim hall. She brewed a tea from herbs whose names she did not speak aloud, adding ingredients that would have seemed strange to any. Observer, water that had never seen sunlight, honey gathered under a full moon, leaves picked at dawn while the dew still held them. As she worked, a small crowd gathered to watch. The hall servants whispered among themselves, pointing at the way the stones seemed to respond to her touch. Even the learned physician found himself drawn to observe, though he crossed himself repeatedly and muttered prayers under his breath. The real healing began when Yrsa placed her hands on the child's chest and began to hum a low, wordless melody that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the hall. The stones pulsed in rhythm with her voice, and gradually, impossibly, the color began to return to Bjorn's cheeks. His breathing deepened, the terrible heat began to fade, and for the first time in days he stirred naturally in his sleep. By dawn, the fever had broken completely. Bjorn opened clear eyes and asked for water in a voice that was weak but unmistakably his own. He smiled at his parents, reached for the carved wooden horse that had been his favorite toy, and even managed a few spoonfuls of broth before falling into the first healthy sleep he had enjoyed in days. The great hall erupted in celebration. Magnus embraced his wife as she wept with relief. Servants crossed themselves and praised whatever powers had restored their young lord. And even the stern-faced physician admitted he had witnessed something beyond his understanding. Around Bjorn's neck, Magnus placed his own silver torque, a twisted band of precious metal that marked its wearer as under the yarl's direct protection. "This child owes his life to your skill," Magnus said to Yrsa, his voice thick with gratitude. "Name your reward, and if it is within my power to grant, it shall be yours." But Yrsa asked for nothing except the knowledge that the boy would grow strong and healthy. She gathered her stones, declined the purse of silver that Ingrid pressed upon her, and made ready to return to her cottage. To her, this had been simply what she did. Healing was its own reward, and the joy of restored life was payment enough for any labor. Yet, as she prepared to leave, she noticed the looks that followed her. Where once there had been simple gratitude and respect, now there was something else, a mixture of awe and unease that made her skin prickle with foreboding. The whispers had a different quality now, and though she could not make out the words, their tone suggested questions rather than praise. It was Astrid who gave voice to what others were thinking. The older healer had watched the entire proceeding from the back of the crowd, her face growing darker as Bjorn's miraculous recovery unfolded. When Yrsa passed her on the way out, Astrid stepped forward with a smile that never reached her eyes. "Remarkable work," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "I have never seen stones glow like that, or heard such strange melodies in a healing. Where did you learn such methods?" "From my grandmother, as you well know," Yrsa replied, sensing the trap, but unable to avoid it entirely. "The same place I learned everything else." "Your grandmother, yes, but I knew her well, and I never saw her use such dramatic techniques. The glowing stones, the otherworldly music. the way the very air seemed to shimmer around you. These are new additions to your craft, are they not? The crowd had grown silent, straining to hear every word. Yrsa felt the weight of their attention like a physical burden, but she kept her voice steady. My skills have grown with experience and practice, as any craft does. The important thing is that the child lives. Indeed, Astrid said, her smile growing sharper. The child lives when all natural remedies had failed. One might wonder what powers you called upon to achieve such a miracle, what prices were paid, what bargains struck, what older gods heard your wordless songs. The accusation hung in the air like smoke, poisoning everything it touched. Several people made the sign of the cross, others reached for protective amulets. Even Magnus looked troubled, though whether by the suggestion itself or by its implications, Yrsa could not tell. I called upon knowledge and compassion, she said firmly, the same powers I have always used, the same ones that have served this village faithfully for years. But the seed was planted, and Astrid was skilled at nurturing such poisonous growth. Over the following days, she spoke carefully to anyone who would listen, never making direct accusations but always asking the right questions. How had the stones glowed with their own light? Why had the air shimmered around Yrsa during the healing? Where had that otherworldly music come from, and what ancient words might it have contained? The village began to remember other unusual healings, other moments when Yrsa's success had seemed too complete, too miraculous. Stories grew in the telling, her garden that flourished beyond reason, the way animals sometimes acted strangely in her presence, the feeling that she could see into a person's very soul when she examined them. Within a week, the whispers had become murmurs. Within 2 weeks, the murmurs had become open speculation. By the 3rd week, a delegation of village elders approached the yarl with their concerns, demanding that Yrsa be brought before them to answer questions about her methods and the source of her power. Magnus found himself caught between gratitude for his son's life and the growing pressure from his advisors and the community. His Christian counselors spoke of the danger of allowing witchcraft to flourish unchallenged. The village elders reminded him of his duty to maintain order and uphold the law. Even some who had benefited from Yrsa's healing began to wonder if they had unknowingly been touched by dark magic. The Jarl's silver torque still hung around young Bjorn's neck, a visible reminder of the debt owed to Yrsa. But debts, Magnus was learning, could become burdens when political winds shifted. The very miracle that had saved his son was now being seen as evidence of forbidden practices, and the woman who had restored his family's happiness was being painted as a threat to the village's soul. When the formal accusation was finally made, it came with the weight of ancient law behind it. Yrsa was charged with practicing sorcery, with consorting with dark powers, and with endangering the spiritual welfare of the community through her unholy arts. The punishment for such crimes, according to the old ways that still governed matters of life and death, was burial alive beneath the sacred tree, a fate reserved for only the most dangerous practitioners of forbidden magic. The woman who had saved a child's life would pay for that salvation with her own, and the village that had once blessed her name would soon watch the earth close over her forever. The storm had come from nowhere, rising like the wrath of forgotten gods to swallow the expedition's ships in walls of black water and screaming wind. Einar, thrice-blooded, had faced death on countless battlefields, but the fury of the northern sea made human violence seem like children's games. One moment, he had been standing on the deck of the Dragon's Breath, watching the coastline fade into mist. The next, he was clinging to broken timber in water so cold it felt like liquid iron against his skin. That had been 6 months ago, though. Time had become a fluid thing in the struggle that followed. 6 months of fighting his way across hostile lands, through kingdoms that saw a lone Norse warrior as either a threat to be eliminated or a prize to be captured. 6 months of healing from wounds that should have killed him, driven forward by nothing more than the memory of gentle hands and whispered promises beneath starlit skies. The carved raven Yrsa had given him still rested against his heart, wrapped in oiled leather to protect it from the elements. During the darkest moments, when infection had set in from a Saxon blade, when he had gone days without food in the wilderness, when despair had whispered that he would never see home again, he had pressed his hand to that small token and felt her presence like a flame in the darkness. His war axe, the massive two-handed weapon that had earned him his fearsome reputation, had become more than a tool of violence during those months. It was survival itself, cutting through underbrush when paths disappeared, breaking ice to reach water, serving as a crutch when his wounded leg could barely support his weight. The intricate carvings along its handle told the story of his victories, but now they seemed to speak of something else entirely, the strength needed not to conquer, but to endure. Einar remembered their last conversation as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. They had met beneath the sacred tree, as was their custom, when the village slept and only the stars bore witness to their love. Yrsa had been different that night, more serious, almost prophetic in the way she spoke about the future. "Promise me something," she had said, her fingers tracing the scars on his hands. "Promise that you will come back to me no matter what tries to keep us apart. I have dreams sometimes, visions of darkness and separation. But I also see light at the end of those shadows, a light that looks like you." He had promised, of course, as men in love always do, but her words had carried a weight that troubled him, even as their ship sailed with the dawn tide. It was as if she had seen something coming, some trial that would test the strength of their bond in ways neither could imagine. The expedition had been successful at first. They had driven off the raiders who had been troubling the coastal settlements, pursued them into unfamiliar waters, and dealt them defeats that would be remembered in song for generations. Einar's axe had drunk deeply of enemy blood, and his reputation had grown even greater among the crews. For a brief time, he had allowed himself to dream of returning home crowned with glory, of laying his victories at Ursa's feet, like offerings to a beloved goddess. But the sea had other plans. The storm that destroyed their fleet had been no natural tempest. The wind had howled with voices that spoke in no human tongue, and the waves had moved with purpose rather than mere fury. In later months, when he had time to reflect, Einar would wonder if some power had intervened to keep him from his destined path, testing whether his love was strong enough to overcome any obstacle. He had washed ashore on a rocky coast far south of any familiar landmark, more dead than alive, and surrounded by the wreckage of what had once been proud warships. For days he had drifted between consciousness and delirium, sustained only by rainwater, caught in broken wood, and whatever sea creatures the tide had left stranded beside him. When strength finally returned enough for him to walk, he had faced a choice that would define the months to follow. He could seek out the nearest Norse settlement, send word of the fleet's fate, and wait for another ship to carry him home. Or he could begin the long journey overland, fighting his way through foreign kingdoms and hostile wilderness to reach Yrsa by his own efforts. The decision had never really been in doubt. Every day of delay was another day of uncertainty for her, another night she would spend watching empty horizons and fearing the worst. The healing stone she had given him pulsed against his chest like a second heartbeat, and in its rhythm he heard her voice calling him home. The journey had been a saga in itself, worthy of its own songs, if any skald had been there to witness it. He had fought bandits in the Saxon forests, escaped capture by rival warbands, survived fever and starvation, and wounds that opened again and again before they could properly heal. Each obstacle had been overcome by the simple refusal to accept. Defeat, love, he discovered, was a more powerful force than even the battle fury that had made him legendary. There had been moments of unexpected kindness along the way, a Christian monk who had tended his wounds without asking his faith, a farming family who had shared their meager food with a dangerous-looking stranger. A blacksmith who had repaired his axe in exchange for help defending his workshop from raiders. These encounters had changed something in Einar's understanding of the world. Heroism was not just about glorious deeds in battle, but about choosing. Compassion when it would be easier to choose indifference. As he traveled north through lands growing more familiar, he had begun to dream of the life he and Yrsa would build together. He was tired of war, weary of the endless cycle of violence that had defined his existence. The warrior's path had brought him fame and fortune, but it had also brought him loneliness and scars that went deeper than flesh. With Yrsa at his side, he could imagine a different kind of strength, the power to heal rather than harm, to build rather than destroy. He had practiced the words he would say when he saw her again, the promises he would make, and the future he would offer. They would marry properly, with the blessing of both the old gods and the new faith if necessary. He would use his skills to protect their community rather than seek glory in distant wars. Together, they would bridge the growing divide between tradition and change, showing that love was stronger than the forces that sought to tear their world apart. But as familiar landmarks began to appear on the horizon, Einar felt a growing unease that he could not explain. The healing stone against his chest had grown cold in recent days, and his dreams were filled with images of darkness and earth, of voices calling from impossible depths. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones, in the way the very air seemed to thicken as he approached home. When he finally crested the hill that overlooked Raven's Hollow, the sight that greeted him froze the blood in his veins. The village looked smaller somehow, more subdued, as if a shadow had fallen across it that no amount of sunlight could dispel. Christian symbols were more prominent than he remembered, and the sacred tree at the center of the settlement was surrounded by what looked like fresh-turned earth. His heart began to pound with a fear more terrible than any he had faced in battle. The earth around the tree, the cold weight of the healing stone, the prophetic sadness in Ursa's voice during their last meeting. Suddenly it all began to make horrible sense. He was home at last, but he might have arrived too late to save the one thing that made home worth reaching. Einar, thrice-blooded, who had never run from any enemy, who had faced impossible odds with laughter on his lips, found his hands shaking as he began his descent toward the village. The war axe on his back felt heavier than ever, not with the weight of metal and wood, but with the terrible possibility that all his strength and skill might not be enough to undo what had been done in his absence. Behind him, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, as if the very sky sensed that a reckoning was at hand. The darkness beneath the earth was absolute, a living thing that pressed against Yrsa from all sides like the weight of the world itself. She lay in her burial shroud, a simple linen cloth that had become both her comfort and her prison, feeling the rough wooden planks above her face and the cold earth that surrounded her small chamber. They had dug deep, following the ancient traditions that demanded the condemned be placed where no light of the living world could reach them. But Yrsa had not come to this fate unprepared. In the hours before her trial, when she had known the outcome was already decided, she had made careful preparations that her accusers could not have imagined. Hidden within the folds of her burial shroud was a hollow reed, no thicker than her thumb, but long enough to reach from her mouth to the surface, a breathing tube that her grandmother had taught her to weave from marsh grass using techniques older than memory. "The earth is not always our enemy," her grandmother had whispered during those long-ago lessons. "Sometimes it protects what it appears to destroy, preserves what seems lost forever. The wise woman learns to work with darkness as well as light, to find life even in the spaces between life and death." Those words sustained her now, as she lay in what most would consider a tomb. The reed allowed her to draw thin sips of surface air, enough to keep consciousness alive, even as her body grew. Weak from hunger and cold, But more than physical survival, she had discovered something unexpected in the depths, a strange peace that came from being forced to let go of everything except the essential truth of her own existence. In the absolute darkness, memory became more vivid than sight had ever been. She saw her childhood with crystalline clarity, running through the village streets with dirt on her knees and flowers in her hair, following her grandmother into the deep woods to gather healing herbs, learning the names and properties of every plant that grew in their northern realm. The old woman had been patient with her endless questions, wise in the ways of both healing and survival. "You have the gift, child," her grandmother had said one autumn day as they gathered mushrooms beneath ancient oaks. "But gifts come with prices. The stronger your healing power grows, the more some will fear you. There may come a time when you must choose between using your abilities and staying safe. When that time comes, remember this: safety that comes from hiding who you truly are is no safety at all." Those words had seemed abstract then, the kind of cryptic wisdom old people dispensed without explanation. Now, buried alive for the crime of healing too well, Yrsa understood their true meaning. She had indeed faced the choice her grandmother had foreseen, and she had chosen to save a child's life, even knowing the cost. She could not regret that decision. Even now, the memories shifted, carrying her forward through the years to the day she had first seen Einar. He had been different from other warriors who visited the village, quieter, more thoughtful, with eyes that held depths of experience rather than simple bravado. When he had come to her seeking treatment for his infected wound, she had sensed something in him that called to her own spirit. Their first real conversation had lasted half the night, ranging across topics from healing techniques to the nature of courage, from ancient myths to dreams of the future. He had spoken of his travels with the wisdom of someone who had learned that strength came in many forms, that the greatest victories were often won without drawing a sword. By dawn, she had known that her heart was no longer entirely her own. Their love had grown like the healing herbs in her garden, slowly, naturally, putting down deep roots that could weather any storm. Einar understood her work in ways that few others did, respected the ancient knowledge she carried without fearing its implications. When she worked with her healing stones, he would sometimes help by maintaining the proper silence, understanding instinctively that some forms of power required reverence rather than mere observation. Now, in the crushing darkness of her burial chamber, she held tight to the memory of his hands, covering hers as they worked together to save a woman in difficult childbirth. The way he had trusted her completely, never questioning her methods or doubting her judgment. The gentleness with which he had touched both the healing stones and her own skin, as if recognizing that both were sacred in their own way. The breathing reed that kept her alive had another purpose as well. Through it came whispers from the world above, fragments of conversation that told her more about her situation than her captors might have wished. She had heard Astrid's voice several times, speaking with other villagers about the cleansing that had been accomplished, the danger that had been safely buried. But she had also heard other voices, filled with doubt and growing unease. Some villagers were beginning to question what they had done. Children asked why the healer lady had to go away, and their parents struggled to explain. Magnus Ironhand's young son had grown ill again, not with fever this time, but with a wasting sadness that no conventional remedy could touch. The boy spoke constantly of the buried lady and refused to eat until she came back to tell him stories. But it was the earth itself that provided Yrsa's greatest revelation. As she lay pressed against the soil, feeling its weight and breathing its essence, she began to understand that she was not being punished, but transformed. The roots of the sacred tree above her stretched deep, and as the hours passed, she felt them drawing closer to where she lay. When the first tentative tendril finally touched her hand, she gasped at the surge of ancient power that flowed through the connection. The tree was old beyond human reckoning, its roots extending far below. the surface and connecting to a network of life that spanned the entire region. Through it, she could sense the slow pulse of the Earth's own heartbeat, the vast cycles of growth and decay and renewal that governed all existence. She was not buried in dead soil, but cradled in the womb of living power, power that recognized her as kin and welcomed her into its embrace. Her grandmother's healing stones, still clutched in her hands within the shroud, began to pulse with responding energy. The runes carved into their surfaces glowed with soft light that the darkness could not diminish, and through them she felt her connection to generations of wise women who had carried the ancient knowledge forward through times of change and persecution. As the third night of her entombment began, Yrsa felt the transformation reaching its peak. She was still physically weak, still dependent on the slender reed for breath and the mercy of her captors for survival. But spiritually, she had never been stronger. The earth had accepted her, the tree had claimed her as its guardian, and power, older than the gods of both the old faith and the new, flowed through her veins like liquid starlight. Above her, she could hear the sound of footsteps moving around the sacred tree, voices raised in what might have been argument or supplication. The village was restless, she realized, troubled by dreams and omens that spoke of powers stirring in the depths. They had thought to bury a dangerous healer, but they had unknowingly planted the seed of something far greater, and somewhere beyond the reach of mortal senses, Yrsa felt another presence approaching, a familiar spirit burning with rage and love in equal measure, fighting its way home against impossible odds. Einar was coming, just as he had promised, and when he arrived, the earth itself would help her rise to meet him. In the depths beneath the sacred tree, Yrsa's dreams had become more real than waking life. The massive root that touched her hand pulsed with ancient memory, and through it she witnessed visions that spanned centuries. The first Norse settlers praying beneath the young tree, wise women of forgotten generations gathering at its base to practice their healing arts. The slow accumulation of power that had made this place sacred long before any god was given a name. She saw herself as a child, running barefoot through the village, while her grandmother watched with knowing eyes. She saw the moment her healing gift first manifested, when she had pressed her small hands against a wounded bird and felt life flow back into its broken wing. Most clearly of all, she saw Einar, not as he had been during their earthly courtship, but as he was now, somewhere far away, fighting with desperate fury to reach her. The visions showed her his journey in fragments of startling clarity. She watched him drag himself from storm-tossed waters onto a foreign shore, his body broken, but his spirit undefeated. She felt his pain as he struggled through hostile lands, every step a battle against enemies both human and natural. Through the sacred root's ancient wisdom, she experienced his grief when he learned of his fleet's destruction, his despair when he thought he might never see home again. But stronger than pain or despair was the love that drove him forward. The visions, she could see it like a golden thread, connecting their hearts across impossible distances, growing brighter rather than dimmer with each mile he traveled. The healing stone she had given him glowed against his chest like a second heart, pulsing in rhythm with the stones she still clutched in her burial shroud. The root whispered secrets to her in the language of growing things, teaching her truths that no human teacher could have conveyed. She learned that the boundary between life and death was far thinner than most believed, that power could be found in the deepest darkness as well as the brightest light. The earth itself was alive, aware, connected in ways that formed a vast network of intelligence spanning the entire world. You are not the first, the ancient consciousness seemed to tell her, speaking in sensations rather than words. Others have lain here before you, drawn by the same gift, tested by the same fears. Some rose transformed, others chose to remain in the deeper sleep. The choice is always yours to make. She understood then that her burial was not simply punishment, but initiation, a rite of passage that would either destroy her utterly or remake her into something far more powerful than she had ever been. The villagers who had condemned her thought they were ending a threat, but they had actually begun a process that would change the very nature of the world, they knew. Above ground, Einar had finally reached the outskirts of Ravenshollow, and what he found there filled him with a rage that shook the very foundations of his being. The village looked wrong somehow, as if a shadow had fallen across it that no amount of sunlight could dispel. Christian symbols were more prominent than he remembered, and there was a quality to the silence that spoke of secrets and shame. He approached carefully, using skills learned in countless campaigns to remain unseen. While he gathered information from hidden positions, he watched the daily life of the settlement, noting changes that went beyond simple religious conversion. The people moved differently now, furtively, with downcast eyes and hurried steps. Children played quietly instead of running wild with laughter. Even the animals seemed subdued, as if sensing that something fundamental had shifted in the balance of their world. When he finally learned the truth, it came from an unexpected source. Old Henrik, the fisherman, who had taught Einar to read the weather when he was still a boy. The old man was mending nets by the shore when Einar approached, and his weathered face lit up with joy at seeing the warrior he had believed dead. Einar thrice-blooded, Henrik whispered, glancing around nervously before embracing him. The gods be praised you live. But how? We heard the fleet was lost, all hands drowned in the great storm. The storm took the ships but spared me, Einar replied grimly. I've spent months fighting my way home, but tell me, old friend, where is Yrsa? I've seen no sign of her cottage or her healing work. The change in Henrik's expression told him everything before words could. The old fisherman's face crumpled with grief and guilt, and when he spoke, his voice was barely audible above the lapping of waves against the shore. She's gone, lad, buried beneath the sacred tree 3 nights past, condemned for practicing dark magic. They said she saved the yarl's boy through sorcery, that her powers came from evil sources. Henrik's hands shook as he continued. Many of us didn't believe it, but the accusations came from those with power, and the old laws were followed. She lies beneath the earth now, where none can hear her voice. The words hit Einar like a physical blow, driving him to his knees on the rocky shore. For a moment, the world seemed to spin around him, reality fracturing under the weight of loss too great to comprehend. But then rage replaced shock, a fury so pure and consuming that it seemed to burn away everything else in his being. Who? He asked, and his voice carried the promise of death. Who made these accusations? Henrik hesitated, clearly afraid of the consequences, but the look in Einar's eyes brooked no refusal. Astrid Nightwhisper led the charges. She convinced the village elders, swayed the Jarl's advisors. Even Magnus himself, he went along with it in the end, though you could see the guilt eating at him like a cancer. Einar rose slowly, his hand moving instinctively to the war axe on his back. For a moment, Henrik thought the legendary warrior might march directly to the village and begin the slaughter that would surely follow such a betrayal. But instead, Einar closed his eyes and pressed his hand to his chest, where Yrsa's healing stone still rested against his heart. The stone was ice-cold now, but as he focused his attention on it, he felt something impossible. A faint pulse, weak but unmistakably there. Not the rhythm of a stopped heart, but something else, something that suggested life persisting in circumstances where life should not be possible. How long has she been buried? He asked urgently. 3 days, Henrik replied, confused by the sudden hope in his friend's voice. They followed the old ways exactly, deep enough that no sound can escape, sealed well enough that no air can enter. By now, but Einar was no longer listening. 3 days was the traditional period for such burials, long enough for the condemned to die from suffocation or despair. But the pulse he felt through Yrsa's stone suggested something that defied tradition and expectation. She was alive down there, somehow, impossibly alive, and every moment of delay brought her closer to death. "Tell no one I have returned," he commanded Henrik, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I must reach her before it's too late." As he strode toward the sacred tree, Einar felt power gathering around him like a storm preparing to break. The healing stone against his chest was warming now, responding to his proximity to its maker. The runes carved on his war axe seemed to glow with their own light, and the very ground trembled beneath his feet. Behind him, Henrik crossed himself and whispered prayers to whatever gods might be listening. He had seen Einar in battle before, had watched him fight impossible odds and emerge victorious. But this was different. This was not a warrior preparing for combat, but a force of nature preparing to reshape the world itself. The sacred tree loomed ahead, its ancient branches reaching towards storm clouds that had gathered with unnatural speed. At its base, the fresh-turned earth marked Yrsa's grave, and as Einar approached he could swear he heard a sound that made his heart leap with impossible hope. The faintest whisper of breath, drawn through some impossible passage from the depths below. She was alive. Against all odds, against the crushing weight of earth and tradition, Yrsa still lived. And now that he had found her, nothing in the 9 worlds would prevent him from bringing her back to the light. The night was deep and moonless when Astrid, Night Whisper, crept toward the sacred tree, a small bundle clutched in her weathered hands. Inside the cloth wrapping lay her most precious and terrible tool, a steel needle no longer than her thumb, its tip coated with a poison that would ensure Yrsa's story ended exactly as Astrid intended. For 3 days, she had waited with growing anxiety, expecting at any moment to hear that the condemned woman had finally succumbed to her fate. But troubling reports had begun to filter back to her ears. Children claimed they could still hear breathing sounds near the burial site. Some villagers swore they saw a faint glow emanating from the earth around the tree's roots. Most disturbing of all, several people reported dreams of Yrsa calling to them, not as a dying woman, but as something transformed and powerful. Astrid's jealousy had not died with Yrsa's condemnation. If anything, it had grown more poisonous. In the days since the burial, the younger woman's miraculous healing of the yarl's child had been the final insult, proof that whatever powers Yrsa commanded far exceeded anything Astrid herself could achieve. Even buried alive, Yrsa continued to overshadow her, becoming the subject of whispered conversations and uneasy speculation. The poison she carried had been prepared with careful malice, distilled from nightshade berries and other deadly plants, whose secrets she had learned during her own training as a healer. Originally, the knowledge had been intended to ease the suffering of those beyond help, providing merciful release from pain. But jealousy had corrupted that knowledge into something darker, turning healing wisdom into an instrument of murder. Her alliance with the Christian zealots had begun as mere convenience, a way to give religious authority to what was essentially personal vengeance. But as the weeks had passed, Astrid had found herself genuinely drawn to their absolute certainty, their black and white view of good and evil. In their company, her jealousy could be reframed as righteous zeal, her desire for Yrsa's destruction, justified as necessary for the spiritual health of the community. Brother Marcus, the most fanatical of the Christian advisors, had whispered encouragement in her ear during the trial. "The old ways must be purged completely," he had said, his eyes burning with fervor. "Those who practice the forbidden arts cannot be allowed to corrupt others, even from the grave. If there is any chance she still lives, any possibility that her evil might spread, then stronger measures must be taken." Now moving like a shadow through the sleeping village, Astrid felt the weight of that sacred mission. She was not simply eliminating a rival, she was cleansing the community of corruption, ensuring that the old powers could never again rise to challenge the new faith. The needle in her hands was not just a weapon, but an instrument of purification, At the base of the sacred tree, she knelt and began to feel through the soft earth with careful fingers. There, barely visible in the darkness, was the tip of what looked like a hollow reed, so thin and well concealed that it was almost invisible. The breathing tube that had somehow allowed Yrsa to survive her intended execution, to mock justice from beyond the grave. Astrid's face twisted with satisfaction as she understood. The condemned woman had cheated death through preparation and, how cunning, but that very cleverness would now become her doom. The breathing reed that had preserved her life would become the pathway for her destruction. With practiced precision, Astrid inserted the poisoned needle into the reed, pushing it deep, enough to ensure the toxin would spread through Ursa's system with her next breath. The poison was designed to work slowly at first, mimicking the gradual weakness of starvation while actually attacking the heart and lungs from within. By dawn, the troublesome healer would finally be truly dead, and the whispers about supernatural survival would be replaced by the quiet satisfaction of completed justice. But as the poison began its deadly journey downward through the reed, something unexpected happened. The earth around the tree's base began to tremble, not with the violence of an earthquake, but with the rhythmic pulse of something vast awakening. The ancient tree's branches swayed without wind, and a sound like distant thunder rumbled from somewhere far below the surface. Deep in her burial chamber, Yrsa felt the poison enter her system like ice spreading through her veins. But the transformation that had been taking place over the past 3 days had changed more than her spiritual nature. Her physical form had been altered as well, strengthened by the same ancient power that flowed through the tree's roots. What should have been a fatal dose became instead a painful but survivable ordeal, her enhanced constitution fighting off the toxin even as it wreaked havoc through her weakened body. More importantly, the attack served as a catalyst, triggering the final stage of her transformation. The tree's roots, sensing the threat to their chosen guardian, responded with a surge of protective power that made the earth itself come alive. Root systems that had grown for centuries began to shift and move, creating passages and chambers that had never existed before. Above ground, Astrid stumbled backward as the trembling intensified. The needle in her hand began to smoke and crumble, consumed by some force she couldn't begin to understand. The Christian symbols she wore around her neck grew hot against her skin, as if the ancient powers awakening beneath her feet found their presence offensive. She tried to flee, but the earth had other plans. Tendrils of root and vine erupted from the soil around the tree, not threatening her with violence, but simply holding her in place with inexorable strength. She would witness what her poison had unleashed, would see the consequences of her jealousy and fear made manifest in the waking world. From the village, people began to emerge from their homes, drawn by instincts they couldn't name and visions that had invaded their sleep. Magnus Ironhand appeared first, still wearing his sleeping clothes, but carrying a sword, his face grim with the knowledge that something momentous was unfolding. Behind him came other villagers, some crossing themselves and muttering prayers, others reaching for the protective amulets of older faiths. The Christian zealots arrived in a group, led by Brother Marcus, with his face set in lines of fanatic determination. They had felt the awakening power as a direct challenge to their authority, a resurgence of the pagan forces they had worked so hard to suppress. In their hands, they carried torches and holy symbols, prepared to battle whatever darkness might emerge from the ancient tree's embrace. But it was young Bjorn, the yarl's son, whose life Yrsa had saved, who understood first what was happening. Breaking free from his parents' protective grip, he ran toward the tree with the fearless certainty of childhood, calling out in a voice that carried across the entire gathering, "She's coming back! The healer lady is coming back!" As if summoned. By his innocent faith, the earth began to crack and split around the tree's base. Light, not the harsh glare of torches, but the soft, warm radiance of life itself, began to seep through the fissures. And from somewhere deep below, a sound rose that made every heart in the village skip a beat. It was not the weak gasping of a dying woman, but a voice raised in song, wordless, powerful, filled with joy and triumph. Yrsa was indeed alive, and whatever had happened to her in the depths had left her far stronger than the woman who had been buried 3 days before. The earth shuddered, the light grew brighter, and across the fjord storm winds began to rise as if nature itself was preparing for a revelation that would change everything. The old ways and the new faith were about to clash in ways none of them had imagined, and at the center of it all, love was preparing to literally move heaven and earth to reclaim what had been lost. Einar's massive hands tore through the earth. Like a man possessed, each handful of soil flung aside with desperate fury. His war axe lay forgotten beside the growing pit as he clawed deeper toward the woman who had become his entire world. Blood streamed from his fingers where rocks had cut him, but he felt no pain, only the driving need to reach Yrsa before death. Could claim what life had made sacred. 3 feet down, his searching hands struck something hard and unexpected. Not wood, not stone, but carved granite worn smooth by countless years. He cleared the dirt away with trembling fingers, revealing symbols that made his breath catch in his throat. The runes were identical to those on Yrsa's healing stones, but older, deeper, carved by hands that had worked when the world was young. "What sorcery is this?" whispered Astrid from where the roots held her captive, but her voice carried more fear than anger now. The ancient runestone Einar had uncovered pulsed with the same soft light that was beginning to seep through cracks in the earth, and the Christian symbols around her neck had grown so hot they burned her skin. Einar traced the carved symbols with wonder, recognizing some from the healing stones he had watched Ursa use, understanding others through knowledge that seemed to flow directly into his mind. The runestone was telling a story, not in words, but in images and sensations that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the soul. He saw the sacred tree as it had been centuries ago, young and slender, planted by the first Norse settlers, not as decoration, but as a living bridge between the world of mortals and the realm of deeper powers. He witnessed generation after generation of wise women gathering at its base, their healing knowledge growing stronger with each passing year as they learned to work with forces older than any named god. Most shocking of all, he saw Yrsa as she truly was. Not simply a village healer who had learned her craft from her grandmother, but the culmination of a bloodline that stretched back to the tree's first guardians. Her ancestors had served as bridges between the old powers and the human world, their gift growing stronger in each generation until it reached its full flowering in her. The burial chamber beneath his hands had never been meant for punishment. It was a place of transformation, where those chosen by ancient powers underwent the final metamorphosis that would allow them to serve as guardians of the balance between life and death, between the wisdom of the past and the needs of the future. What the village elders had meant as execution had actually been the trigger for Yrsa's true awakening. She was never in danger, Einar breathed, understanding flooding through him like dawn breaking over dark water. They didn't bury her to kill her, they buried her to complete her destiny. But even as revelation transformed his understanding of what had happened, urgency drove him to dig deeper. Yrsa might be undergoing transformation rather than dying, but Astrid's poison was still working its way through her system, and even enhanced powers had their limits. He could feel her weakening through the connection that bound their hearts, her strength flowing away like water through cracked stone. His hands broke through into empty space, and suddenly he could hear her breathing, shallow and labored, but unmistakably alive. The burial chamber was larger than he had expected, not a cramped grave, but a carefully constructed sanctuary lined with ancient stones that hummed with power, and there, wrapped in her burial shroud, but glowing with inner light, was Yrsa. She opened her eyes as his hands touched hers, and he gasped at what he saw there. The familiar brown depths he had loved were now flecked with gold, and in them he could see knowledge that spanned centuries. She was still his Yrsa, but she was also something more, a bridge between the human and divine, transformed by her, a time in the earth's embrace. "You came," she whispered, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate through the very stones around them. "I saw you in my visions, fighting your way home through storm and battle. But Einar, I'm poisoned. Astrid's hatred reached me even here." The toxin was indeed spreading through her system, and even her enhanced constitution was struggling to contain it. But as their hands joined, something magnificent happened. The healing stone she had given him blazed with light against his chest, and the runes carved on his war axe began to glow in response. Power flowed between them. Not just the love that had sustained them both through months of separation, but something older and deeper. "We are bound," Ursa said, wonder in her voice. "Not just by love, but by destiny itself. The old powers knew we would find each other, knew that together we could bridge the gap between the world that was and the world that must be." Through their joined hands, she showed him visions that made his warrior's heart soar with possibility. He saw a future where strength served wisdom instead of destroying it, where the old knowledge and new faith could coexist without mutual destruction. He saw himself not as Einar the destroyer, but as Einar the protector, using his legendary skills to guard those who chose healing over hatred. Above them, the village had erupted in chaos. The gathering crowd was split between those who saw the supernatural events as divine miracle and those who viewed them as demonic manifestation. Christian zealots faced off against those who still honored the old ways, while Magnus Ironhand tried desperately to maintain order. But it was the runestone itself that provided the final revelation. As Einar's blood from his torn hands dripped onto its ancient surface, the carved symbols flared with blinding light and projected images into the air above the tree. Images that told the true history of Raven's Hollow and its sacred guardian. The villagers gasped as they saw their ancestors working with the tree's power, witnessed generations of healers serving their community with gifts that came not from darkness, but from the deepest sources of life itself. They watched Ursa's grandmother and the grandmothers before her, maintaining the balance that kept their settlement prosperous and protected. Most shocking of all, they saw the truth about the recent accusations. The runestone revealed Astrid's jealousy in vivid detail, showed her poisoning the very community she claimed to protect with lies and manipulation. It displayed her recent attempt at murder, the needle that had carried death into what should have been a place of transformation. "Lies!" Brother Marcus shouted, raising his torch as if to strike the stone projection. "Pagan deceptions meant to corrupt the faithful. Do not let these false visions turn you from the true path." But his words fell on increasingly deaf ears. The assembled villagers could see the truth burning in the air before them, could feel the power radiating from the ancient tree, and understand that it was not evil, but simply older than their current understanding. Even some of the Christian converts began to cross themselves and back away from the zealots' rhetoric, recognizing that wisdom could take many forms. In the depths below, Ursa's transformation reached its completion. The poison that should have killed her was absorbed and neutralized by powers that had been building for 3 days of communion with the earth's deepest secrets. She rose from her burial shroud like a phoenix from ashes, her body glowing with inner light, her healing abilities magnified beyond anything she had previously imagined. But more than power, she had gained understanding. She saw now that the conflict tearing her village apart was part of a larger struggle between fear and wisdom, between those who would destroy what they could not understand and those who sought to build bridges between different ways of knowing. "The divine, help me up," she said to Einar, and as he lifted her toward the surface, the very earth seemed to assist them, roots and stones shifting to create a pathway that led from the depths toward the light above. The sacred tree's branches spread wide in welcome, and flowers that had not bloomed for decades burst into sudden, brilliant life. The crowd fell silent as Yrsa emerged from the earth like a living goddess, supported by Einar's strength but radiating power that was entirely her own. She stood at the base of the sacred tree, no longer the village healer they had known, but something far greater. A guardian of ancient wisdom, a bridge between worlds, living proof that death was not the end, but simply another form of transformation. And as she looked around at the faces of those who had condemned her, Yrsa's expression was not one of anger or vengeance, but of infinite compassion. She had been given the power to destroy her enemies, but she had also been given the wisdom to know that healing was always the greater choice. The silence that fell over the gathering was absolute, broken only by the whisper of wind through the sacred tree's suddenly blooming branches. Yrsa stood at the base of the ancient trunk, her burial shroud transformed into robes that seemed woven from moonlight and shadow, her skin glowing with an inner radiance that made the torches seem pale by comparison. Beside her, Einar rose from the excavated earth like a titan emerging from the underworld, his war axe forgotten in favor of the protective stance that proclaimed his eternal devotion. The Thor hammer pendant that had belonged to his grandfather hung at Einar's throat, and as the crowd watched in amazement, the ancient amulet began to pulse with its own light, not the harsh glare of lightning, but the steady glow of a forge fire that promised both creation and destruction. The runes carved into the small silver hammer matched those on the runestone they had uncovered, and those on Yrsa's healing stones, telling a story of connections that spanned generations. "This cannot be allowed," Brother Marcus hissed, his face twisted with fanatic fury. Around him, his most devoted followers raised their torches higher, the flames casting dancing shadows that made their expression seem demonic rather than holy. "She has returned from the dead through dark magic. She must be destroyed completely, burned until nothing remains to corrupt the faithful." But his call to violence was met with uncertainty rather than enthusiasm. The villagers had seen the truth, revealed in the runestone's projections, had watched the ancient history of their settlement unfold in blazing light. Many who had supported Yrsa's condemnation now stood with downcast eyes, shame weighing heavy on their shoulders as they realized they had been manipulated by jealousy masquerading as righteousness. Magnus Ironhand stepped forward, his face grave, with the knowledge that the next few moments would determine not just Yrsa's fate, but the future of his entire community. The yarl had spent 3 days in torment, knowing he had betrayed the woman who saved his son's life, understanding that his political calculations had led him to support an injustice that would stain his honor forever. "Stand down," he commanded his guards, men who had been prepared to support whatever action their lord deemed necessary. "Lower your weapons. We have seen enough blood spilled by fear and misunderstanding." Young Bjorn broke free from his mother's protective embrace and ran toward Yrsa without hesitation, his child's instincts recognizing the healer who had saved his life despite the supernatural circumstances of her return. When he reached her, she knelt and gathered him into her arms, and the boy's laughter rang out clear and joyful across the tense gathering. "I knew you would come back," Bjorn said, his small hands touching her glowing face with complete trust. "I told everyone, but they wouldn't listen. I knew the healing lady wouldn't leave us forever." Yrsa's transformation had not diminished her capacity for love. If anything, it had magnified it. As she held the child who had been the catalyst, for her ordeal, she felt the full weight of responsibility that came with her new role. She was no longer simply a village healer, but a guardian of the balance between worlds, charged with protecting not just bodies, but souls, not just individuals, but entire communities. "I'm here now," she whispered to Bjorn, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to soothe every troubled heart in the crowd. And I bring healing for everyone who needs it, not just of flesh, but of the wounds that divide us from each other." Einar moved to stand beside her, his massive frame serving as both protection and declaration. The months of battle and hardship had changed him as well, burning away the restless aggression that had once driven him from conflict to conflict. In its place was a focused determination that spoke of a man who had found his true purpose at last. "I have traveled across half the world to return to her," he announced, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the gathering. "I have fought through storms and enemies, endured pain and loss that would break lesser men. But I tell you now, the greatest battle I have ever faced was against my own despair when I learned what had been done in my absence." His hand moved to the pendant at his throat, and as he spoke, the ancient amulet's glow intensified. "This belonged to my grandfather, who served as protector to a wise woman much like Yrsa. He taught me that true strength comes not from the ability to destroy, but from the courage to defend what is sacred. I claim that role now, before all of you. I am Yrsa's protector, her champion, and the guardian of the ancient ways she represents." The crowd stirred restlessly, sensing that momentous changes were taking place before their eyes. Some had expected violence, others had hoped for miraculous healing, but what they were witnessing was something far more profound. The conscious choice of their community's future direction, the decision between fear and wisdom that would echo through generations to come. Astrid remained trapped by the living roots that had erupted from the earth, but her captivity had given her time to witness the full scope of what she had set in motion. The jealousy that had driven her to destroy, Ursa was cracking under the weight of supernatural revelation, and in its place came something she had not felt in years: genuine remorse. "I was wrong," she whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying clearly in the preternatural silence. "I let envy poison my heart, turned healing knowledge into an instrument of death. The darkness I claimed to see in Yrsa was really the darkness within myself, reflected back like an image in still water." Yrsa turned toward her former accuser, and in her transformed eyes, Astrid saw not the condemnation she deserved, but something far more challenging: forgiveness offered freely, without conditions or demands for penance. It was a mercy that cut, deeper than any punishment could have, forcing her to confront the full measure of what she had almost accomplished. The supernatural atmosphere that surrounded the sacred tree was beginning to affect everyone present in different ways. Children laughed and played, instinctively recognizing benevolent power and responding with joy. Adults found themselves remembering childhood moments of wonder, times when the world had seemed full of magic and possibility. Even the animals of the village had gathered, dogs wagging their tails, cats purring as they wove between human legs, birds singing from every available perch. But the Christian zealots, led by Brother Marcus, were experiencing something quite different. The presence of the ancient powers made their symbols burn against their skin, and their prayers seemed to echo back empty and hollow. For men who had built their identity on absolute certainty, the demonstration of divine authority that did not flow through their established channels was profoundly threatening. "She is a demon wearing the face of the dead," Marcus shouted, raising his torch as if to strike at Yrsa herself. "Do not be deceived by false miracles. The true God demands that we cleanse this place with fire." But as he stepped forward, something extraordinary happened. The sacred tree's branches swept downward without wind to guide them, not striking the zealot, but simply blocking his path with a wall of living wood. The message was clear. Violence would not be permitted in this place, regardless of the religious justification offered for it. Yrsa stood slowly, still holding young Bjorn in her arms, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had walked in the spaces between life and death, and returned with deeper understanding. "I offer you a choice," she said, addressing the entire gathering, but looking particularly at those who had supported her condemnation. "You can cling to fear, to the hatred of anything that challenges your certainty, and watch as that poison destroys everything beautiful in your lives. Or you can choose wisdom, the understanding that the divine speaks through many voices, that healing can take forms you have never imagined, and that love is always stronger than the forces that seek to divide us. As she spoke, the healing stones in her hands began to pulse with renewed power, and the very air around the sacred tree seemed to shimmer with possibility. The transformation was not complete. The final confrontation still lay ahead, the ultimate test of whether her community would choose the path of growth or destruction. But the foundations had been laid for something unprecedented in their history. A synthesis of old wisdom and new faith, a recognition that the sacred could not be contained within the boundaries of any single tradition. What happened next would depend on the courage of ordinary people to embrace change, to choose hope over fear, and to trust in love's power to heal even the deepest wounds. The stage was set for a battle that would be fought not with weapons, but with the far more powerful forces of compassion and understanding, where victory would be measured not in enemies defeated, but in hearts transformed and communities reunited. And at the center of it all stood Yrsa and Einar, living proof that some bonds are stronger than death itself, some loves powerful enough to literally move heaven and earth. The moment Einar lifted Yrsa fully from the earth, his voice erupted. From his chest, with the force of thunder rolling across the fjord, "She's mine!" The roar seemed to shake the very foundations of the world, sending ravens into flight from every tree and causing the surface of the distant water to ripple as if struck by invisible stones. It was not the cry of a possessive man claiming property, but the declaration of a soul recognizing its other half, a bond that transcended death itself and would not be broken by human fear or divine judgment. The transformation that had taken place during Ursa's 3 days beneath the earth was now fully visible to every observer. Her skin held a luminescence that seemed to come from within, as if she had swallowed starlight and made it part of her essence. Her hair, once simple brown, now caught and reflected light in ways that defied natural law, and her eyes held depths that spoke of wisdom gained through communion with powers older than memory. But it was the sacred tree itself that provided the most dramatic proof of her changed nature. As Yrsa's feet touched the ground beside its massive trunk, winter branches that had been bare for months suddenly burst into full bloom. Flowers of every color imaginable, some that grew naturally in their northern climate, others that belonged to distant lands, opened in defiant celebration of life conquering death. The impossible blossoms glowed with their own inner light, and their fragrance carried on the wind with a sweetness that made hearts lift and spirits soar. The villagers stumbled backward in amazement, many falling to their knees as they witnessed what could only be described as a miracle. Children pointed and laughed with delight, while their parents crossed themselves and whispered prayers to whatever divine power they thought might be responsible for such wonders. Magnus Ironhand stood frozen between conflicting emotions, his warrior's pragmatism warring with the undeniable evidence of supernatural intervention. The woman he had condemned to death was not only alive, but transformed into something that defied all his understanding of the world's natural order. The guilt that had been eating at him for 3 days now seemed insignificant compared to the magnitude of what he was witnessing. "Impossible," he breathed, but even as the word left his lips, he knew it was meaningless in the face of what stood before him. Young Bjorn clapped his hands in pure joy, his child's heart accepting the miraculous without question. "Look, Papa," he called to his father, "the tree is happy, it's singing with flowers." And indeed there seemed to be music in the air. Not audible sound, but something felt in the bones and blood, a harmony that spoke of natural forces working in perfect balance. The ancient tree swayed gently despite the absence of wind, its flower-laden branches moving in patterns that suggested intelligence and intention. Einar positioned himself protectively beside Yrsa, his war axe finally in his hands but held low, its blade resting against the earth. He was prepared for violence if it came, but his stance spoke of defense rather than aggression. The months of struggle to reach this moment had burned away much of the battle fury that had once defined him, replacing it with focused determination and unshakable purpose. The supernatural atmosphere that surrounded them was affecting everyone differently. Some of the villagers felt drawn closer, magnetized by the sense of benevolent power and ancient wisdom. Others retreated, overwhelmed by forces they could not understand or control. But none could deny that they were witnessing something that would be remembered and spoken of for generations. Astrid remained held fast by the living roots that had erupted from the earth, but her expression had undergone its own transformation. The bitter jealousy that had driven her to attempted murder was cracking like ice in spring sun, revealing beneath it a depth of shame and self-loathing that was almost too painful to witness. She had expected to feel satisfaction at Yrsa's death, but instead found herself confronted with the full magnitude of what she had almost destroyed. "Forgive me," she whispered, though whether to Yrsa, to the divine powers she sensed stirring around them, or to her own corrupted soul was unclear. Even to herself, the Christian zealots led by Brother Marcus were the most disturbed by the unfolding events. Their theology had no room for miracles that occurred outside their established channels of divine authority, and the obvious benevolence of the power surrounding Yrsa challenged their fundamental understanding of good and evil. Some began to back away, their certainty shaken by what they could not dismiss or explain. But Marcus himself only grew more fanatical in his opposition. "Deception!" he screamed, raising his torch like a weapon. "The enemy of souls appears as an angel of light, to mislead the faithful. Do not be seduced by false wonders." Yet even as he spoke, his voice carried less conviction than before. The trees' blooming branches seemed to mock his words, and the joy on the faces around him, particularly the innocent delight of children, made his accusations sound hollow and desperate. The stage was set for the final confrontation, the moment when the community would choose between fear and wonder, between the safety of rigid doctrine and the challenging beauty of divine mystery that refused to be contained within human understanding. Brother Marcus raised his poisoned blade, a ceremonial dagger he had blessed for the purpose of destroying what he saw as demonic corruption, and lunged toward Yrsa with fanatic determination. But before the weapon could find its mark, Einar moved, with the fluid precision that had made him legendary in battle, his war axe sweeping up in a defensive arc that sent the zealot's dagger spinning harmlessly into the darkness. The confrontation that followed was not the brutal clash of arms that many expected, but something far more profound. As Marcus stumbled backward, his face twisted with rage and fear, Astrid's ceramic scrying bowl, the black vessel she had used for dark divination, suddenly cracked down its center with a sound like breaking bones. Dark liquid that might have been blood seeped from the fracture, and the bowl's surface began to smoke and hiss as if touched by acid. "Your darkness has no power here," Yrsa said quietly, her voice carrying such absolute authority that even the zealot froze in place. "I have walked in the spaces between life and death, communed with powers that were ancient when your God was young, and I tell you this, there is no evil in what I am, only the fulfillment of purposes you are too frightened to understand." She stepped toward Marcus, and as she moved, the very air around her shimmered with benevolent energy. The flowers blooming impossibly on the sacred tree's branches seemed to lean toward her, and even the ground beneath her feet responded with small shoots of green grass pushing through the winter-hardened earth. "You speak of corruption," she continued, "but look around you. See what my presence brings: life, growth, healing, joy in the hearts of children. If this is evil, then evil has forgotten its own nature." The zealot's response was to clutch his holy symbols more tightly, as if their physical presence could ward off the doubt that was creeping into his heart. but the cross around his neck had grown so hot it was burning his skin, and the prayers that had once come easily to his lips now felt hollow and meaningless. It was then that Yrsa did something that shocked everyone present. She reached out with gentle hands and touched the source of Marcus's pain, the burned flesh where his symbol had seared him. The healing that flowed from her fingers was immediate and complete, not just of the physical wound, but of something deeper, older, more fundamental. For a brief moment, Marcus felt what Yrsa truly was, not a demon or a witch, but a bridge between different ways of understanding the divine, a healer whose power came from love rather than hatred, wisdom rather than fear. The experience lasted only seconds, but in that time, his entire worldview cracked like Astrid's broken bowl. "I don't understand," he whispered, his voice stripped of its earlier certainty. "My faith tells me you must be evil, but your touch brings only healing. How can this be?" "Because the divine is larger than any single understanding of it," Yrsa replied with infinite gentleness. "Your God and the ancient powers I serve are not enemies. They are different faces of the same truth, different ways of approaching the mystery that lies at the heart of existence." The transformation was not complete. Marcus would need time to reconcile his rigid beliefs with what he had experienced, but the seed had been planted. He stepped back, his weapon forgotten, his certainty shattered, but his heart somehow lighter than it had been in years. The real test came when Magnus Ironhand approached, his young son in his arms, and shame heavy on his shoulders. The yarl, who had condemned Yrsa to death, now stood before her transformed presence, understanding the full weight of his betrayal, but hoping against hope for forgiveness he knew he did not deserve. "I failed you," he said simply, his voice breaking with emotion. "I let fear override honor, let political pressure corrupt justice. My son lives because of your skill, and I repaid that gift by supporting your execution. There is no forgiveness for such dishonor." Young Bjorn reached out from his father's arms toward Ursa, and she took the child gently, holding him close, while looking directly into Magnus's eyes. "You are wrong," she said. "There is forgiveness for everything when the heart truly seeks to change. Your son is sick again, not in body this time, but in spirit. He feels the weight of the injustice done in his name, and it is poisoning his young soul." As she spoke, she placed one glowing hand on Bjorn's forehead, and the child's face immediately brightened with relief. The guilt and confusion that had been troubling him since her burial simply melted away, replaced by the pure joy that should have been his natural state. "He is healed," Yrsa announced, "and so can you be, if you choose wisdom over fear from this day forward." The crowd that had gathered to witness what they thought would be either a miracle or an abomination, instead saw something far more powerful: the conscious choice of their community to embrace healing over hatred, understanding over ignorance, love over the forces that sought to divide them. One by one, the villagers knelt, not in worship, but in recognition of the sacred moment they were sharing. The transformation of their entire world, from a place ruled by fear into one governed by compassion and wisdom. 6 months later, the village of Ravenshollow had become something unprecedented in the northern lands, a place where the cross and the hammer coexisted in harmony, where Christian prayers were offered alongside ancient rituals, and where healing came in whatever form the patient needed most. The sacred tree at the settlement's heart bloomed year-round now, its impossible flowers serving as a daily reminder that love could indeed work miracles when given the chance. Yrsa moved through her expanded role as both healer and spiritual, guide with the same quiet grace she had always possessed, but now enhanced by wisdom, gained through her communion with forces older than human memory. Her cottage had been rebuilt larger and closer to the tree, with rooms for teaching as well as healing, and a steady stream of visitors came from distant settlements to learn from the woman who had conquered death itself. The transformation in her abilities was remarkable to witness. Where once she had been merely gifted, now her touch could mend bones in minutes, her voice could calm the most troubled minds, and her presence could bring peace to spaces that had known only conflict. But more importantly, she had learned to teach others to find their own healing gifts, understanding that wisdom shared was wisdom multiplied. Young Bjorn had become her first and most dedicated apprentice, his natural enthusiasm tempered by genuine compassion and an intuitive understanding of the healing arts that amazed even experienced practitioners. The boy, who had nearly died from fever, now served as living proof that recovery was possible from even the darkest circumstances, and his laughter could be heard throughout the village as he helped tend Yrsa's impossibly abundant garden. Einar had found his true calling as protector not of a single village, but of the new harmony they had created. His legendary skills were now employed in training young men and women to defend their communities without becoming consumed by the violence they wielded. His war axe hung over the mantel of their shared home, still ready for use if needed, but more often serving as a reminder that strength should protect rather than dominate. The change in him was perhaps the most remarkable transformation of all. The restless warrior, who had once sought glory in distant battles, had become a man of deep contentment, finding greater satisfaction in teaching a child to defend the weak than he had ever found in conquering enemies. His love for Yrsa had not diminished with familiarity. If anything, watching her daily acts of healing had deepened his respect and devotion beyond anything he had thought possible. Their marriage ceremony beneath the blooming sacred tree had become the stuff of legend throughout the region. Conducted according to both Christian and Norse traditions, blessed by Brother Marcus, whose own theological understanding had expanded dramatically, and celebrated by villagers of every faith, it had served as a living symbol of unity in diversity. The wedding stones they had exchanged were carved river rocks, their surfaces inscribed with intertwining runes that told the story of their love in symbols both ancient and eternal. Einar's stone bore the mark of protection, while Yrsa's carried the sign of healing, and when held together, the two rocks created a pattern that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. Magnus Ironhand had proven true to his word, governing with wisdom rather than fear, and ensuring that the village's new harmony was protected from those who would destroy it out of ignorance or malice. His son's recovery, both physical and spiritual, had taught him that true strength came from admitting mistakes and working to correct them, rather than from stubbornly defending positions that experience had proven wrong. Even Astrid had found redemption in the months that followed. Her jealousy and hatred had been burned away by the supernatural encounter, leaving behind a woman desperate to atone for the harm she had caused. Under Ursa's patient guidance, she had learned to channel her knowledge of herbs and healing into purely beneficial purposes, discovering that helping others brought far greater satisfaction than the competitive desire to be superior. The poisoned needle that had been the instrument of her attempted murder had been transformed into a tool for precise healing work, its dark purpose purified by genuine repentance and the conscious choice to serve life rather than death. She would never again be the village's primary healer, but she had found peace in serving as Yrsa's assistant and learning from the woman she had once tried to destroy. Brother Marcus had undergone perhaps the most dramatic theological evolution, his rigid certainty replaced by a humble recognition that the divine could not be contained within any single human understanding. He continued to serve his Christian community faithfully, but now his sermons spoke of love's power to bridge all divisions, of the many faces that divine compassion could wear, and of the need to see sacred truth wherever it might be found. Thus, children of Raven's Hollow grew up in this atmosphere of expanded possibility, learning from birth that differences in belief need not lead to conflict, that healing could come through prayer or herbs or the simple touch of caring hands. They would carry this wisdom forward into their own lives, ensuring that the transformation Yrsa and Einar had begun would continue through generations yet to be born. On quiet evenings, when their daily work was done, Yrsa and Einar would sit beneath the sacred tree and watch the impossible flowers glow in the darkness. In those moments, holding their wedding stones and feeling the steady pulse of power that flowed through their joined hands, they knew that love had indeed proven stronger than death, wisdom more powerful than fear, and hope capable of transforming even the most broken and divided communities. The woman who had been buried alive had not only risen from the earth, she had lifted an entire village with her, showing them that the greatest miracles were not supernatural displays of power, but the simple daily choice to heal rather than harm, to build rather than destroy, to love rather than fear whatever challenged their understanding of the world. Their story became a song sung in halls throughout the northern lands, but more importantly, it became a living example of what was possible when ordinary people chose to embrace the extraordinary power of compassion. The sacred tree bloomed eternal, the healing stones pulsed with ancient wisdom, and love continued to work its quiet miracles in the hearts of all who witnessed what Yrsa and Einar had built together.